It is All Saints Sunday. It is a fascinating day. And the reason it's fascinating, it is because it is the day we choose to hurt our hearts. And you know that? It is the day that we literally choose to do what is called a process called grieving. Grieving is the only emotional pain that you go, I'm going to intentionally feel pain in order to get better. In order to get better. It is like a physical pain that you say, hey, this doesn't work anymore, and therefore I'm going to go to the doctor, and I'm going to intentionally know that while I have surgery, I'm going to come out and it's going to be hurting like crazy. In time, it will get better. Grieving is the emotional pain that we do the same thing. We look and we go, this is a hole in our heart. This is a hole in my life. I'm going to intentionally induce pain. I'm going to intentionally sit with it. I'm going to intentionally create an experience in which I can go, this hurts. But the other side of it's worth it. The other side of it is better. This is from the Smithsonian, November 2018. It's a magazine that the Smithsonian organization does. It says, never forget, there has always been the idea behind the teaching of the Holocaust in schools, and listening to eyewitnesses' accounts that we should never forget. But as we mark the 80th anniversary, and I've messed this up twice, so you have to help me out. The name of this concentration camp, Kristallnacht. Anybody know the real pronunciation of it? We had a German in the first service who said it twice, and I went, yeah, what she said, because I still couldn't get it. As we celebrate the 80th anniversary of this concentration camp this month, the youngest Holocaust survivor enters their 9th decade. The world is showing dangerous signs of memory loss as a culture. In the U.S., the number of neo-Nazi groups has been rising from 99 in 2017 to 122 in 2018. Fascist groups are brazenly gathering and scoring political victories all across Europe, from France and Hungary to Poland, and incredibly, Italy and even Germany. Now listen to this. This is huge. Last year, a far-right German politician attacked the very premise of Berlin's memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, saying, the laughable policy of coming to terms with the past is crippling us. The laughable policy of coming to terms with the past is crippling us. This politician literally believes that the idea of coming to terms with the evils of the past, or with the losses of the past, or with the sufferings of the past, cripples us into going into the future. Now, this is a neo-Nazi group leader, and I'm just going to be a little politically incorrect here, but that's okay. We're in church. You can do that. It should be no surprise that when someone is working on behalf of satanic forces, such as that person, that they do not want us to come to terms with the past. Because that is exactly the work that God longs to do with us. God longs to move us forward by using the past, not as a way of crippling us, but as a way of growing us up. Often coming to terms with the past is the process called grieving. Let me be clear. It is not pain-free. It is not quick. It is not easy. It is not a shot in the arm. We give you a sticker and a lollipop and you move on and you will be fine. It is an intensive time. Sometimes years. The reality of it is, if it is a deep enough wound, it is a lifetime process of working through a loss, and that loss can be a loved one who has died, a relationship that has ended, a friendship that has ended. It can be the loss of a teddy bear or an item. We see 3-year-olds grieve when their teddy bear is suddenly gone. The process demands emotional energy, time, and tears. And with this price, It is no wonder that so few of us choose to go on the journey, to be freed from the past or to come to terms with the past, to experience the glory that God has. Let me speak to my middle schoolers in the back for just a second. The reason that you struggle so much when suddenly you found out you were going to middle school and had to leave your other building was because you were grieving the loss of the securities and whatever you had in that building. And you moved somewhere scary, somewhere unknown, somewhere that was frightening. And you have a choice. Now, all of us in this room, get this now. You have a choice. I can say, I'm going to endure that. I'm going to feel everything that goes on, or I can ignore it. Pretend it doesn't hurt, pretend that it doesn't matter, and never talk about it. And therefore, I will never get past it. And some of you will start dating in a matter of years. Your parents, including me, are all going, please, Lord, no. You will have your heart broken. You will choose then how you want to grieve. In this room, there are those among us who have grieved improperly and self-medicated in ways that were destructive. There are those among us in this room who have grieved in healthy ways and experienced and chose things that would help us move forward. When you suffer your first heartbreak, I pray that we are the place you run to and go, what do I do with all this hurt? And I pray that Sundays like today is when the church intentionally invests and the kids that are around us get to see adults who go, this is how you grieve. And that we are not afraid to talk about our losses, our heartbreaks, our heartaches. But rather we set an example for how this could become. The journey from loss in the past to the future that God desires for us. Yesterday I was in Columbus for a youth meeting, and I saw a bumper sticker in the car in front of me, and it said, boldly going nowhere. I wanted to see the age of the person driving, and I thought, I know a lot of adults in their 40s and 50s that could be on their car. But because I was in the context of this message, and when I do a message on Sunday, I'm thinking about it usually 2 or 3 weeks in advance, and I just sit with it and let it soak. And I was thinking, you know what? This is the statement for people who do not process their grief. People who do not process their grief are stuck at whatever moment that grief has happened and cannot seem to emotionally move forward and grow up as God has designed for us to say, that happened, it was tragic, let's learn from it, let's move on, let's heal, let's become wiser and smarter because of it. In fact, it was several years ago I was meeting with a psychologist, and I was kind of lamenting with her as we were talking about one of the members of our church who wanted the two of us to be in a room with her as she shared her story. And so the psychologist and I met earlier, and I thought this was a whole weird setup, and so we met beforehand because I said, all right, well, how's this work? And she said, let me just take the lead. And I went, great, I'll sit back and watch because it's not really what I like to do. And so she said to me, she said, just listen and watch this. She said, what's your major concern, though? And I said, well, my major concern is here's a person in their 40s who acts like they're 12. And I said, my major concern is that emotionally and spiritually, this person has never gotten past 12. I said, the things that she does and says, I feel like I want to say to her, are you really 12? Some of you have friends like that, right? She said, all right, let's meet with her. In the meeting, the girl began, again, a girl, woman in her 40s, began to share the tragic story of her brother who died when she was 14, and all the crisis and how her life's never quite been right since then. At the end of her sharing, the psychologist said to her, I have a couple questions. How old were you when your brother died? And she said, I was 14. And the psychologist looked at me and said, do you understand yet? And later she walked out of the meeting because she thought I didn't get it, which maybe I didn't. She said, you understand that she had her brother die when she was 14 and has never matured emotionally past that stage of life because she won't put that to bed. She will not grieve it properly. And she has spent her life trying to grieve it, but in unhealthy ways. So, church, it is our chance and opportunity to talk about how we grieve and are there healthy ways to grieve. Last week we spent a lot of time talking about the temple, and we talked about how that David committed a sin, called for a census, and that the angel of death stops at the threshing floor here. And at this very spot where the angel of death stops, and David and his men ran to a sackcloth and ashes and said, God, take our lives instead of the people. At that very spot is where an altar was built. At that very spot became the Holy of Holies. At that very spot, the temple was literally built around by David's son Solomon. And we talk about how God took what was a mess and made something beautiful. And so it was a beautiful mess. The spot of tragedy, as thousands of lives were lost, that then that spot marked it. God said, let me make something beautiful from this. And the process of grieving, this is how this might look like if we do it wrong. All right, here's the spot. David's built a temple, and God comes in and says, hey, let me take this and make something beautiful. I'm going to take all these broken pieces, all these shattered dreams, all these shattered lives, all these cries that you feel were not answered and prayers that were not answered, and I want to make something beautiful. I want to make a temple. I'm going to start to work today. And you can just see Solomon go, no, we can't touch this. This is my mess, God. I know it's a mess. It's a beautiful mess. So I want to take all the broken pieces and I want to make them into something beautiful. I want to bring healing. I want to bring wholeness. I want to move forward. I want to grow you and the nation up. No, God. You don't understand. We like to sit with our mess. We're never going to move past it. In fact, we're never going to rebuild here. We're never going to do anything with this mess because it is a shrine to just absolute disaster. And every time we walk by, we want to remember the heartache and heartbreak, not the glory of your work of restoration. Now, to say that Solomon would say that sounds so silly to us, and yet that's how many of us live our lives with tragic situations and moments that happened in our past. We live saying, no, don't touch this, God, don't heal this. Or we live saying to the counselor, don't touch this, don't heal this. Or we live saying to our church small group, don't touch that. Don't go there. We don't talk about that. In fact, many of us have family gatherings in which we don't talk about anything, because if we talked about anything of substance, we might accidentally talk about that. You know the that in your family? That which shall not be mentioned, Lord Baltimore? So where do we learn to grieve? Where do we learn to process this? Well, surprisingly, we go to Jesus. We can talk about the temple. Jesus is riding a donkey in on a day that we call Palm Sunday. And so Jesus comes in on Eeyore, and he's marching in, and people are ripping off palm branches and throwing them in front of Jesus, and they're shouting, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. And the people are shouting like, the King has come. They're like, this is Jesus. They're high-fiving. They're chest bumping. Fireworks are going off. The spray little string things are shooting everywhere. I mean, it is a big deal. The band's playing. The kids are running around. They're tossing candy. And he gets to the edge of the Mount of Olives here. And he's standing, or he's riding there on his donkey. And the parade stops as Jesus kind of pulls back the reins and halts everything. And I think the setting's fascinating. Because if you're in the parade line, you're the last guy in the back. You're the one that's always late getting the news. And you can see there's like a ripple effect of emotional change coming back the line of the parade. And where you're sitting there celebrating, you're still going, woo, Jesus is here. Woo, things are going to be different from now on. Jesus is here. Suddenly you hear people, shh, shh. And it's one of those crowd shushes that something's wrong. By the time it makes its way back to the last mother and her kid who is just excited there's confetti and doesn't understand the significance of what's going on, she learns that Jesus is on his donkey looking over the city Jerusalem, and specifically the temple, and he's weeping. Luke 19 says, as he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, and he wept over it, and he said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace. but now it's hidden from your eyes. Jesus goes on to predict the destruction of the temple and how terrible it's going to be. And it is because Jesus is not locked into our time, but rather sees into the future, that He is aware of what's coming and He weeps because of it. And He is in the process that we call grieving. Did you know that God grieved? He took time to recognize the hurt and loss and felt sorrow. Wow. So huge in our culture that wants to have instant fixes, in our microwave society that wants it fixed yesterday, that doesn't want to deal with anything, in a culture where we feel like we have to talk people into sharing their feelings, that we run into a God who publicly, mind you, has no problem with pausing on a donkey in the middle of a parade party and saying, let's just all grieve for a second. Because where there's sorrow, we should grieve. Because where there's sorrow, we should grieve. Listen, every heartbreak, heartache, every death, every loss, every boo-boo, every wound, every broken dream brings with it the possibility of learning, of growing, and transforming us into the person that God dreams we could be. One of the most important processes, Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. Henry Townsend say, one of the most important processes in life is grief. God has designed grief to help us get over things. And grief is simply the acknowledgement of this hurts, and I'm going to take it in. Because the only thing to do with grief is to just sit with it. And the reality of it is, the best thing you can do with grief is to say, let's become friends. It is the only emotional pain we voluntarily endure for the sake of growing up and becoming healthy. Paul talks about grief in Romans 12:15. He says, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. Jesus again speaks about it when He's on a mount. And because He's on a mount, He's given a sermon, and the church is really crafty. And we said, Jesus is on a mountain, He's given a sermon. Let's call it the big sermon that Jesus spoke to a lot of people. And no, they said, let's call it the Sermon on the Mount. That's how creative the church was. Right? Jesus says this, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Listen, God never intended for us to get sick or die. God never intended for us to endure the heartache that we endure. All that comes out of our story, which begins in Genesis when Adam and Eve choose not to trust God and want to do it their own way. And from that moment on, then we live with the big question. Because Adam and Eve ate the fruit because ultimately they don't believe God has what's best for them in mind. Because if God had what's best for us in mind, they would trust Him and obey that they're not going to eat the fruit which God said don't eat. And from that moment on, when they break that trust, when they say, I don't really believe that God has what's best for us in mind, we spend the rest of eternity as humans asking one question. Does God really care? To find the answer to that, we have to go to my favorite story of Jesus grieving. We have to go to my favorite story of Jesus grieving. It's about a guy named Lazarus. Do you know the story of Lazarus? Let me give it to you real quick. So Jesus and the disciples are on a camp out. By the way, Jesus is a manly man. That guy's always like camping out. You ever notice that? The guy walks everywhere. He's always on a hike somewhere along the way. It's like the hike of doom constantly for Jesus, right? Just always out hiking, right? And so there he is. He's out hanging out by the river one day with the disciples. They're tenting it out. And Lazarus becomes sick. And Mary and Martha flip on their GPS. They track down Jesus' iPhone. And no, that's not true. You know, Jesus would never have had an iPhone. He's got an Android. And so they track down where Jesus is at, and they go get Jesus, right? They send a messenger to Jesus, and they get to Jesus, and they say, Jesus, the one you love is sick. Now, this is important because this isn't just anybody that we're talking about. This is Lazarus, like one of Jesus' apparently best friends. Like maybe even some kind of a mentor to Jesus. as he was growing up. Maybe it was the guy that always hung out with Joseph and him, and they hung out together. The one you love is sick. Now, if you know anything about the stories of Jesus, you should have an expectation right here. Jesus is going to do what? He's going to go, right? That's when you read the gospel accounts of Jesus and what he does, each one of the gospel authors, Jesus seems like a superhero almost, right? It's like, hey, Jesus, this person's got a demon. Da, 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 I'm going to run to him, right? Hey, Jesus, this person's sick. Da, 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 I'm going to go take care of it. Jesus, hey, we need a dude over here. Da, 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 Jesus, we're out of food. Da, 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 Happy Meals for everybody. Boom. Right? It's like Jesus just runs from crisis to crisis. Can you imagine being his secretary? Jesus, where are you? You are supposed to be over here at a speaking engagement. I don't care how many demons they have. Where are you? It's not where you're supposed to be, right? Why? Because it just seems to like, here's a crisis. He runs to it and saves the day and ministers to people. And so when Lazarus is sick, we should have an expectation that Jesus is like, let's go. In fact, guys, this is a big deal. We're not even going to walk. I know, but just, I'm God, okay? We're going to teleport. We're going to do what? Trust me, they're going to love it later. We're going to watch Star Trek, and they're all going to know about it. But you guys don't know about it, but yeah, we're going to be the first, ready? Holy Spirit, beam me over, right? Right? They don't have to, but no, what's Jesus do? Check this out. He says to the disciples, we're not going. What? Let's stay here. It's a great camping spot, guys. Just chill out, relax. We're taking some time off. We're kind of recharging. Just stay here. Thomas apparently thinks that Jesus is actually maybe afraid to go because Judea is the last time Jesus was in Judea, they tried to stone him. And let me tell you what, no matter how you spin it, a PR story of Jesus being stoned is just a hard one to get in public. Come on, that was funny. The PR story of Jesus being stoned. Never mind. There's some days I feel like maybe my humor's wasted on this. You know that? And so Jesus literally says to the disciples, let's stay here. And Thomas goes, hey, he doesn't want to go because we're going to be killed. So that's okay. Let's just stay here. And then 2 days later, Jesus stands up in the middle of breakfast and says, hey, it's time to go. The disciples go, where are we going? Jesus says, we're going to go see Lazarus. And they said, well, why are we going to go see Lazarus? And Jesus says, because he's asleep. And the disciples go, well, good for Lazarus. He was sick. Now he's asleep. He's going to get better, Jesus. We don't need to go see Lazarus. Remember, they're going to stone you there. And Jesus goes, you guys don't get it. He's not asleep. He's like dead asleep. Like asleep meaning not sleeping, like silent sleeping, but sleeping like, hey, the big snap that he's in with the coffin and the tomb, and he's gone. And the disciples are really confused now. Well, you didn't want to go see him when he was sick, but now that he's dead, we're going to go see him. We're going to go to the funeral. And Jesus says, yep, we're going to go. Let's go. And Jesus says, and look, you guys don't get it. I'm glad we didn't rush off. In fact, it's better for you that we hung out here because what you're about to experience is going to blow your socks off. Which is really cool because the disciples never wore socks. They just wore sandals. So, I mean, that's a big deal. And Thomas says this famous phrase, and again, this is one of those moments where you got to realize that the disciples were ready to go with Jesus anywhere, which makes Jesus' death moment when they scatter such a big deal. Thomas literally says, all right, let's go with him and we're all going to die. I mean, Thomas is ready for the Alamo moment, right? Remember the Alamo. We're going with Jesus to Judea. We're all going to die. Again, why that's so huge is because when we get to, hey, Jesus' trial, these brave men who are ready to die with Jesus all scatter, which makes the fact that they're willing to give their life later for the resurrection even more powerful. Again, it is a testimony to the reality that the resurrection is a historical fact. And so they go with Jesus, and they go to Bethany. They get to Bethany, and if you know Lazarus' sisters, Martha and Mary, Martha comes running out to Jesus. And she says this phrase to Jesus that I am so glad that our authors, John, didn't try to clean up the story. Because sometimes if you got a hero that's not real, you clean it up. But when you have a hero that's real, you just kind of write history down as it happened. And that's what John's doing. He writes history down as it happens. And so Martha runs out to Jesus. And she says this statement. She says, Lord, if only you had been here. Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now this is important. Do you see the grief in this statement? In fact, if you want, this is one of those fun moments in the Bible where you can read this with a different tone of voice, and you can make it a cry for help. You can make it like this is anger at Jesus, which is kind of how I read the story. I think this person's really ticked at Jesus right here. All right, but again, you can read it however tone of voice you want. But I think she's like, Lord, if only you had been here. I mean, you run everywhere else. You get there on time. I mean, why do you drive that old beater car? Why can't you ever show up on time? You know this is a problem for you. And here we had a moment where we needed you to show up on time, and you couldn't show up on time. You wouldn't show up on time. And then I heard the rumor that not only did you not show up on time, but you spent 2 more days fishing by the river. Just camping out. Well, you had been here on time. And do you hear the question, do you really care? Let me tell you what, there's nothing that distorts our view of God quicker than pain that Satan is allowed to twist. There's nothing that distorts our view of God quicker than pain that Satan is allowed to twist for his delights. There's nothing that distorts our view of God quicker than pain that Satan is allowed to twist for his delights. So Jesus smacks her upside the face and says, Woman, I'm God. I spent 3 days sleeping beside Peter. The guy snores. I haven't got any sleep. I haven't got any rest. I show up. I finally got to the funeral. Be happy that I'm here. Why do you have to act this way? And we all laugh, but at the same time, many of us have a distorted view of God, or you have a friend who has a distorted view of God. That's how Jesus really should respond to Martha. I mean, some of us live with this idea that God's always angry, that He's always upset, that He's punishing us for sins. Like, God becomes this petty 13-year-old school child who just can't handle big boy problems. That's not the way Jesus responds. Jesus recognizes a couple facts. You ready? Number one, grief is the only pain that heals all others. And it is the most important pain there is. And I can see Jesus looking around Martha, and if you read the story, you see that there's a crowd of people that are surrounding her. This is a little side note just for us in our today culture. All right? True grief can only be accomplished in the context of a relationship. And how Jesus responds to Martha is in the context of a relationship that says, I'm about to bring some healing. But notice that He doesn't insult her for her grief. He doesn't call her out and tell her she's stupid. He doesn't do any of those things that you've heard church people say, well, if you just had more faith, you wouldn't even ever feel any sorrow. If you just have believed in Jesus, you know we're going to get to heaven. You don't need to be sad that your loved one died. If you just really, really, really prayed harder, that wouldn't have happened. They wouldn't have got sick. If you just loved God more, this all would have worked out completely different. You know, we've all heard situations where, again, people who we think love Jesus, I don't know if they do or not, but they say really stupid stuff. Jesus doesn't say any of that to her. And if there's anybody who has the right to condemn someone for their grief, it's Jesus. And instead, He embraces Martha in that moment. Why? Because true grief can only be accomplished in the context of relationships. She's got a community around her, and now she's doing it one-on-one with Jesus. Jesus says to her, Martha, your brother will rise again. Martha does what the rest of us would do. She immediately goes into Sunday school context and says, yeah, I know Jesus. He's going to rise again at the end of the days. I got it. But man, if you were only here, if you had only been here, we wouldn't need for that to wait. And Jesus then makes a statement that should rock our world. He says, I am the resurrection. Those who believe in me, even though they die, they will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. This is the very phrase that Jesus says to Martha. It is a phrase that we pronounce at every funeral in the Methodist Church. I am the resurrection and the life, Jesus says. Those who believe in me, even though they die, yet will they live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. And then Jesus says to Martha, do you believe this? She looks at Jesus, and I don't think she gets it yet. Because let's face it, growing in our faith is what we do. She, yeah, I believe it, but I don't think she really gets it yet. Just pause a second. Because it doesn't matter what you've lost. It doesn't matter what you're hurting. It doesn't matter how big it is, how small it is, from the candy bar that you're wishing someone hadn't stole out of the fridge during lunch break, to the boyfriend that broke up with you in 8th grade, to the fact that maybe you're wondering if anybody can ever love me and you're 45, to a divorce, to an actual death, to a bankruptcy, to last week I saw someone lost their dog. It doesn't matter how big or small that grief is. Let me just tell you what. We do not grieve as those who mourn without hope. We grieve as those with hope, because Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. And then he asks each one of us, you can drop this right off the screen, right off your scripture, your phone, whatever you're reading into, and tape it onto your heart and just go for a second. Do you believe this? Because if you do, it doesn't mean you don't grieve. It just means you grieve differently. Because the ancient Greeks, when you were dead, we just said goodbye, and we're like, well, goodbye, sorry, you're gone forever, that's the end. This, we say goodbye, we're going to meet you again. This, we say, thy heart was broken, but we serve a God who takes a place of destruction and torment, a place where the angel of death literally stood, and God says, I'm going to build a temple here. A sign forever that says, watch what I do with a beautiful mess. And sometimes that's the only hope we have. If you are in the midst of absolute despair and depression, I just want to just give you this little bonus fact. Are you ready? Jesus said, I am the resurrection. Meaning, I love to take dead things and bring them back to life. Amen? Oh, come on. Jesus said, I love to take dead things and bring them back to life. Amen? Jesus goes on in, and next he runs into the other sister, Mary, and Mary says to him, I love it. Jesus, if only you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Now, see, you got to pause, because if they both said the same thing, you got to think. Jesus took a couple days. Lazarus has been dead for like 3 or 4 days. The sisters have had time to rehearse this, talk about it, become angry with Jesus, become upset with Jesus, right? Because sometimes in the midst of grief, in the midst of struggling, you lash out at other people. Some of you have suffered that, right? And they're lashing out at Jesus, and so the sisters have rehearsed it. And again, Jesus has the opportunity to just step in, and this is what he does. He says, I'm tired of you sisters. And he calls down a lightning bolt from heaven and says, smite you! Boom! No, we serve a patient God. We serve a patient God. This time Jesus doesn't even speak, but he says this. When Jesus saw her weeping, this is John 11, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews that had come with her also, why? Because we don't grieve alone. He was greatly disturbed in the spirit and deeply moved. What that means is Jesus saw the grief and was emotionally moved and began to grieve with him. You know what I'm talking about. Someone who laughs, you hang around with them, and you kind of start to laugh a little bit too, and people go, why are you laughing? I don't really know. It's funny. Right? Same thing when you see somebody crying. Unless you become cold-hearted, guess what? Emotionally, you kind of start to cry. A couple weeks ago, I was with a couple guys, and one of them began to share the story, and he started crying, and I'm sitting there staring at him thinking, this is not a worth crying story. But he's starting to sob. Next thing I know, I cried too. Jesus says, where have you laid Lazarus? And they lead Jesus to the tomb. And those of you that love trivia, here's your big verse, shortest verse of the Bible. Ready? The big one. Ready? Next time you do trivia, what's the shortest verse of the Bible? It's John 11:35. Jesus wept. When I was a little kid, I thought I said Jesus swept because I thought he was cleaning the house. Jesus wept. Notice that Jesus' response to human grief is to grieve with us. Jesus wept. Now you may know the end of the story. You know that Jesus goes on. He calls Lazarus back from the dead. And everybody celebrates. And this party moment. But I don't want to rush there. Because I kind of see Jesus wept. Meaning that Jesus didn't go, I don't know why you guys are crying. I mean, if you knew what I was about to do, you wouldn't be crying at all. You're a bunch of fools. See, Jesus crawls into the emotion with them and grieves with them. As the proverb says, there's a time for peace, a time for hate, a time for war, a time for sorrow, a time for joy. This is a time for sorrow. It's a time to grieve. Turn, turn, turn. Jesus weeps with them. And I don't think he rushed through that moment. Because we serve a God who understands what it means to be in sorrow. And we serve a God who understands that the way to become healthy and whole is to acknowledge the loss and grieve it. This morning, I don't want to rush to the miracle either. Because for me, there are situations in life, like we said, where we need to just learn how to grieve. We need to sit with each other in the midst of the sorrow and grieve it. So let me give you a couple thoughts on grieving. Ready? A couple thoughts on grieving. Number one, acknowledge the hurt. And what I mean by that is it's hard to grieve something you're ignoring or denying. So-and-so broke up with me. That didn't really bother me. It's no big deal. You seem really bothered by it. I mean, in a crappy attitude the past 2 weeks, eh? No, that situation, but I didn't mind getting fired. I'm looking for a new job anyways. You kind of act like a jerk right now. I don't know. You seem like maybe it bothers you. No. So-and-so said they didn't want to be friends anymore. It wasn't a big deal. I didn't want to be friends with her anyway. She's a jerk. Hey, you've cried yourself to sleep the past 2 nights. You see, those are denial, and we're never going to grieve because we won't even acknowledge that we hurt. Reminds me of someone's got like a big old knife sticking out of the back. You know, you got a knife sticking out of your back. No. It's his blood flesh wound. Thank you. Number 2. Once you claim this is what I'm grieving, don't run from it. You see, I think many of us will go, this hurts, and then we start that grieving process, and oh, that hurts, I don't want to go over there at all. And we go back over here and we do what we do. We put on a false face and pretend it doesn't hurt, and therefore, here's what happens to us. Every relationship we have, every encounter we have with someone from now on, that's a false smile that we wear. Because why? Because I haven't really grieved the pain that I have. Therefore, I'm always wearing a mask. You never get to meet the real me. Because the real me is broken and hurting. And then we run into the secret life where it's like if you knew the real me, you wouldn't like or love me. And so I can't show you the real me that's broken and hurting because it's not the fun, happy me that's fake. Number 3. Who are you grieving with and who is grieving with you? We can't do grief alone. You can cry alone, and that's helpful. But this is that moment where the church should rally around each other and cry and grieve. And we need people who are going to rally around us. And let me just say this. If you don't have relationships right now, and I'm so thankful for many of you who did this for me, but if you don't have relationships right now where people won't leave you alone when you are in a mess, you need to get some. Because our natural instinct is to pull back, pull away, and not talk to people. If you don't have relationships of friends who love you enough to say, I know I'm bothering you. I hope I'm not bothering you, but I probably am. But I'm calling you again. Why? Because I care. You need to get some of those. And you may need to be that for some people. And if you have a friend that's grieving, please interrupt their life on a regular basis and help them grieve. Finally, last phrase that's important for us to get. If Jesus wept, this is just for the men in the house. Okay? Because you women are ahead of us. Right? But if Jesus wept, men, real men cry. Let me say that one more time. If Jesus wept, real men cry. Got it? So, here's what I can't do. I can't tell you, here's step 1, 2, and 3 for grieving. Which would be really nice, and I would love to give you that package. And again, I would love to say, here it is. If you do this, you're going to be fine tomorrow. But I can't because it's all circumstantial. And what's your backstory, and then how long is it going to take. And grieving is one of those things where sometimes we even need help to sit through. And so to my middle schoolers, you may need an adult who's willing to help you grieve. To my adults, you may need a counselor, but never do it alone because we can't grieve by ourselves. But take a note from our God who says, I'm willing to pause my life to acknowledge loss and weep, to cry, to feel the sorrow and grieve. The loss of lives in a building, the loss of a friend. Jesus taught us how to grieve. Acknowledge it and sit with the hurt in